Okay, American History 2 students, here's our first video over new material for the remainder of the 2019-2020 school year. This is going to be about the Cold War.
Wow, you're fast.
So, the Cold War, I kind of started introducing this towards the end of World War II. You have the Soviets that are moving from east to west. You have the United States that are moving from west to east. Both know that whatever land they occupy, they want to make that country or the people that live in that land most like themselves, meaning the Soviet Union wants to make that land, those countries, those people communist. The United States wants to make them nationalist. They want to give them a democratic type government. They want to allow the people to choose what direction they want to go. They want to have a capitalistic economy where the Soviet Union, everything's going to be government control. The government's going to run all industry. They're going to own all the land. They're going to own all transportation systems, all communication systems. And we got to remember, communism isn't so much a type of government as it is a type of economy. And so the government's going to determine what types of natural resources are going to be handed out, how much are going to be handed out. Really, in communism, the only one that gets rich is government. Everyone else is really kept on the same level. Now, you will have a small number of individuals that will have an opportunity to become very wealthy in communism. Those people normally have a connection with the government in one way or another. But normally, everyone is kept pretty much on the same level. Communism was a concept that was introduced by Karl Marx, who was a German philosopher, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who was the first communist leader of Russia. He led the Bolshevik Revolution. He led the Reds. He was a student of Karl Marx, and Lenin started communism, and now Stalin has taken it over, and Stalin has really kind of upped it because Stalin didn't want anyone to pose any kind of a threat. So if you posed a threat to Stalin, you were gone. So what we have now is we have the Soviet Union, we have the United States. Each of them is trying to occupy as much of Europe as they can without upsetting the other one. So, like it says, a Cold War is a state of hostility just short of an armed conflict. And I mentioned what the United States wanted to do. Here's what the Soviet Union wanted to do. And what ends up happening is that Germany, and here's Germany right here. Germany ends up getting split into 4 different zones. The Russian zone, British, American, and then the French zone. And you see that the French did not get a very large zone, but then again, the French didn't do a whole lot in World War II except surrender after 30 days. The other interesting side note, Berlin, the capital of Germany, is in the Russian zone. However, even though Berlin's in the Russian zone, all 4 countries occupy Berlin, meaning that there's part of Berlin that's under Russian control, part under US, part under Great Britain, and part under France. And this really upsets the Russians quite a bit. You know, the Russians say, okay, what's a city in the British zone and the American zone and the French zone that gets divided up into 4 parts, that the Russians have an opportunity to occupy a small area in each one of these 3 zones? And these 3 countries, the leaders of these countries say, well, there isn't. And Stalin is like, well, why Berlin? And they said, well, Berlin is the capital. You know, it's the hub of political activity. The Russians didn't like it, but the Russians went along with it. Now, Eastern Europe, countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, they were they became known as communist satellite countries. Why were they called a satellite country? Well, think about it this way. We have satellites that orbit Earth 24/7, 365. They orbit Earth on a predetermined uh, flight of path, or I'm sorry, path of flight. And the satellite takes that path based upon numbers that have been typed in. So you have someone sitting in front of a computer down here on Earth, and they're basically telling that satellite what to do, the speed at which it's going to travel, the path that it's going to take. And so here you have someone here on Earth controlling something that's very far away. Now, you can't see Moscow on this map, but Moscow is located way to the east of East Germany, of Czechoslovakia, of Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, which are actually down here to the south of Germany. And here, probably a good 1,000+ miles away, is Moscow. Moscow is telling these countries what to do. Here's the economy you're going to have. This is the way the government is going to function. The government's going to control everything. They're going to control all transportation, all communication. People are not going to have essential freedoms like we know it. There's not going to be freedom of the press. The information that is delivered to the people is going to be censored. Religion, there's really only going to be a couple types of religion, and it's mainly going to be Russian Orthodox. Freedom of speech. Nope, no such thing as freedom of speech. You're not going to talk bad about Stalin. Right to assemble. No, you're not going to have the right to assemble, because if you have the right to assemble, then that could cause something like a protest, and that's bad for government. And then freedom of petition. Nope, you're not going to be able to petition the government for anything. So the essential freedoms, especially those that make up our First Amendment here, those aren't going to exist in this area. So you have Moscow. It's a long ways away. It's controlling these countries, satellite country. And so when this happens, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Churchill, one of the best leaders that any country in the history of the world has ever had, and Churchill makes a comment that when the Soviet Union, when they took control of East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, later on Yugoslavia, he will say that an iron curtain has descended over Eastern Europe. If you think about, why is it that people put curtains on a house? Yeah, they put them on there so people aren't looking in their windows. You got pervos that want to be looking in windows, but it's really not that reason. You put them on there so that you keep sunlight out. Also, you keep cold air out. But in this case, you also, in the wintertime, you want to keep warm air in. And in the summertime, you want to keep the cool air in. Well, this iron curtain that Churchill is making reference to, it's not so much about what the Soviets are keeping out of their country. It's what they want to keep in their country. They don't want people leaving their country. They want people to stay there. Early on, the Soviet borders are going to be a little laxed, but as time goes on, the Soviets are really going to tighten the nuts down on those bolts, and they're really going to make the borders extremely secure. So we're going to move on here. What happens? We have a situation that's going on in Greece and in Turkey. In Greece, there's a civil war that's erupting, and the communists are trying to get money to the rebels that are trying to establish a communist form of government in Greece. And in Turkey, the communists are trying to establish themselves in the Turkish government. And the United States, the thing is, after World War II, there's only two countries in the world that have a strong enough economy and a strong enough military to really apply pressure to other countries, and that's the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States comes out of World War II even stronger than they were going into the war, and the Soviet Union took on the very powerful Nazi military and defeated them. And Truman goes to Congress, and he basically tells Congress, if we don't step in and help Greece and Turkey, then once they fall, other countries are going to fall. If Greece goes down, Italy, which is just right across, I think it's the Tyrrhenian Sea from Greece, then there's a good chance that they're going to go down. And if Italy goes down, then communism is going to spread right up into the main part of Europe. Then it's probably going to go into Spain and Portugal, and then possibly even Switzerland, even though they've always been a neutral country, and then maybe even Austria, and then of course, France and Belgium and the Netherlands and up into the Scandinavian peninsula. And so Truman convinces Congress to release $400 million to help Greece and Turkey. This is known as the Truman Doctrine, and it works. The Marshall Plan is essentially an add-on to the Truman Doctrine, only this generates even more money. And with the Marshall Plan, Russia's even given the opportunity to have some of this money, and same with the Soviet satellite countries. But those countries don't dare take the money. Russia's not going to take the money. Again, the Marshall Plan is just an extension of the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine, that money was just earmarked for Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan, it's for all of Europe, and it's basically to help rebuild their economies, because the United States, we have the luxury of looking back at what did not work in World War II, after World War I. A lot of people say, why do we study history? Well, we study history so we don't make the same mistakes. We have a chance to see what happened, what mistakes were made after World War I. Okay, let's not make them again. The economy of Germany was plundered. Okay, we can't let that happen this time. Everybody's economy needs to be rebuilt. Now, what happens is, over in Berlin, again, you have these different zones. Now, this is Berlin. There's the Russian zone, the British zone, the American. I'm sorry, Berlin's right here. Berlin's divided into different zones. The Russians are upset. They want the Americans, the French, the British out of there, and they say no. And so what the Soviets do is they say, okay, we are going to form a blockade, and nothing's getting into the part of Berlin that we control. The U.S., the British, and the French, they merged their zones of Berlin. So instead of having three different zones, it was just Berlin. And then you had the other part of Berlin that was under Russian control. And the Russians didn't like that. People started leaving the Russian-controlled part of Berlin. They wanted to go to the other part of Berlin, and Russians didn't like it. So they said, okay, we're going to put up this barbed wire fence, and we're going to put guards on different roads, and no one gets in or out. And they told the other three countries, they said, we're not going to take down this blockade until you reestablish your three different zones. And the British, the French, the Americans said, no, we're not going to do it. They said, okay, the people in Berlin are going to suffer. What they did was they put a blockade around the outside of Berlin. So even though the people in the French, British, and American part of Berlin were allowed to mingle amongst themselves, nothing could get to the people in Berlin. So the British and the French, nonstop, they started flying what are called sorties to get supplies to the people of Berlin. I'm going to stop this video right here, and then I'm going to pick up with another shorter one.